I don't know about you, but it feels like everyone is just that extra bit nostalgic about things recently. And it's even gotten to the point where we're romanticizing 2016. Now, I understand I'm at the top end of Gen Z, okay? The age allegations are incoming. But romanticizing 2016 feels like a stretch. There's something really uncanny about seeing 2016, which really wasn't that long ago, being romanticized on people's social media feeds as if it was some sort of incredible time. I saw a post the other day and it was like, imagine being in school from the years 2015 to 2019. And it was like a mood board of like all these things that I personally consider to be exceptionally cringe. But look, it is what it is. Romanticize what you want to romanticize. I'm not going to stop you. In this episode, I kind of want to use 2016 nostalgia as a springboard to talk about nostalgia in general, because Gen Z are actually among one of the most nostalgic generations at the moment, which is really interesting given we haven't really been around for that long. There's not much time there to be romanticizing, and yet we're feeling very nostalgic for the past. Could that be because we're not satisfied with the present, or is there something else at play? And of course, it wouldn't be a From the Diving Board episode if we didn't also look at the political connotations of nostalgia and what the effect is of using nostalgia in political campaigning. For example, campaigns like Make America Great Again arguably hinge on nostalgia as one of their core tenets of the entire conservative campaign. So before we get into this episode, I wanted to just thank you guys all for sticking around, for being here, and for showing me so much support. And welcome to everyone who is new. It's so excited to have you. This podcast is dedicated to looking at culture from a political lens, because politics and culture ultimately feed each other, and that's what we are unpacking, looking at media literacy, trying to encourage critical thinking as one of the most important things that we can have right now. And not to go off on a tangent too soon into the episode, I do think that in the context of the last week or so, we all need to prioritize critical thinking as one of the most important skills that we have. We need to practice critical thinking. We need to make sure that we're not falling into binaries, research as much as possible, cross-check those references. I'm sounding like your high school teacher, but I'm seriously serious. It's so important. It is so important. I hope you're doing okay. It's been a pretty intense news week and a lot's been going on. And I'm going to get into it a little bit further into the episode, just talking about, the rise of the far right and how nostalgia plays a big role in that actually. And obviously when we're looking at it from a pop culture lens, it's fun and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. We do need to be really critical about how it's applied and the connotations of what it means. I think we should jump into the episode today. From the Diving Board is a show hosted by me, charlichats, dedicated to decoding digital culture by unpacking the hidden politics behind the screen. Looking at 2016 specifically, I think there's something quite uncanny about that era being romanticized, because 2016 doesn't really feel that long ago. There's something bizarre about seeing like the Kylie Jenner lip kit, the particular makeup of the era, that statue trend. It's just, please, it's so funny to me. The dog filter on Snapchat, these cannot be real. Like, I still look back on photos of that and I'm like, ugh, people want to go back to then. But I think there's a lot of merit to actually wanting to go back 10 years, because it was 10 years ago. That's crazy to me. There are various reasons why people might have picked 2016 as a romanticized era, and I don't think it's just because of the fashion. For a start, we weren't as addicted to our phones. Social media wasn't so omnipresent, and artificial intelligence, while it existed through things like Google Home and Alexa, the idea of replacing humans with AI wasn't a legitimate threat that we were actually considering back then. And so, I think that life was slightly simpler. And I think that's where the romanticization of 2016 comes in. The way that we used social media, from my memory, was still very much to communicate with our friends. It just wasn't, there wasn't the infinite scroll. There wasn't the doom scroll, and there was kind of a set period of time that you'd be online and offline. And so, of course, while we're really romanticizing only the culture of 2016 with the Rio de Janeiro filter and Coachella outfits and Topshop making a resurgence, I don't think you can always separate completely the culture from the politics. I mean, hello, that's the entire point of this episode, this entire podcast. I do think that, as we'll get into a little bit later, something about nostalgia in particular is that it does use a rose-tinted glasses lens when looking at specific periods in the past. We do segregate the good from the bad. One of the reasons why I think this can be a bit concerning is that we don't view the past from a completely objective lens, and without some critical thinking, we romanticize the past to a fault, to the point where what we're romanticizing didn't actually happen. Like it's a distorted memory. It doesn't exist. To bring some objectivity to the conversation, and while I understand it's obviously not 2016 politics specifically that's being romanticized, I think it is important to highlight that in 2016, this was the year when Donald Trump got elected for the first time in the United States. This was the year when his campaign was so influenced by misinformation and disinformation and echo chambers on social media to a point that we hadn't seen before, which arguably has really changed the context of democracy ever since. It was also the same year that the United Kingdom voted to leave the EU, sparking Brexit, the craze that is Brexit. The South Sudanese war intensified, and once again it was the hottest year on record, a record that just keeps getting broken. And obviously we aren't romanticizing these political times, these political situations that occurred, but they did really spark the culture and they were omnipresent. You couldn't have the ripped skinny jeans without Donald Trump being in office, okay? They're interconnected. And in fact, even looking at cultural contexts specifically as well, it's not like they were free from flaws either. 2016 Tumblr was a pretty dangerous place to be in terms of mental illness and mental health and the romanticization of mental illness and the inescapable echo chambers that really fostered dangerous thought patterns and dangerous thinking without really any content moderation or support networks on Tumblr at the time either. In fact, I did a whole piece on Substack about this if you're interested, so at From the Diving Board if you want to read about that. But as I said, it's really interesting that we're able to look back on the past in such a segregated light, in such a segregated way. And when I was looking into this, I found some research undertaken by various psychologists, Terence R. Mitchell and Lee Thompson, who basically explained this phenomenon of looking back in the past with rose-tinted glasses as rosy retrospection. Now, they specifically defined this phenomenon as the tendency for people to remember and recollect events they experience more fondly and positively than they evaluated them to be at the time of their occurrence. Now, obviously, we don't always look back on the past with rose-tinted glasses. There are going to be various conditions and contextual factors at play. For example, trauma is going to have a completely different manifestation on the brain when you're remembering events that were impacted by trauma, for example. And even according to these researchers, they said that there are certain life events that we're going to recall with greater romanticization than others, even if those events weren't actually that great at the time. So an example is, they say that if you've achieved a big life milestone, for example, like buying a house, then you may be more inclined to look back on that period with rose-tinted glasses, even though you may have experienced extreme levels of stress at the time, and perhaps it wasn't actually the best time of your life, but you remember it in such a romantic way. They say this as well for events that you recall when you have stronger personal involvement in them as well. If you did a lot to make something happen, or if you were very heavily engaged in a particular project, for example, you might recall that as being better than it actually was or felt at the time. But it may not just be because of certain life events occurring in certain eras, because of course, not everyone had a really significant life event happen in 2016. There's got to be other reasons why we're romanticizing this era and why we romanticize the past in general. And according to Dr. Nikki Coleman, this could actually be due to the vast amounts of information that we consume on a day-to-day basis. Because we have so much information online that we're privy to, it's literally humanly impossible to critically analyze every single piece of information that we're being fed. And so Dr. Nikki Coleman says that we rely on shortcuts that assist us to process that information faster. She actually says that this leads us to inflate positive memories and deflate negative ones because, according to her, it would require a lot of cognitive energy for us to relive all of the negativity, threat, and fear, so we just go, oh, it wasn't that bad. And again, this is very different in the context of trauma, but I do think this has got perhaps quite a lot to do with why Gen Z in particular are romanticizing the past with such fondness, because we are on our phones a lot. And according to research, led by GWI, nostalgia in general, across the board, across generations, is actually on the rise. This may not surprise you, given we've seen a lot of marketing hinge on nostalgia recently. We've seen movies like Freakier Friday come out, The Devil Wears Prada 2 is coming out soon, and I think there's even a new Princess Diaries coming out as well. We've also seen the way that brands have really tapped into that inner child marketing. Really, that therapy speak that you're healing your inner child has been tapped into by brands and corporations to sell, particularly Gen Z, collectible toys like the Sunny Angel or the Labubu. All of these things that kind of typically you would think that they would be aimed at children, but in fact the market research is showing they are very, very specifically marketed towards adults. That's quite unique. That's quite interesting. Obviously, collector culture has always existed and it's always been a big part of culture, but I do think right now we're seeing this nostalgic marketing to such a degree that there has to be something going on here. There is something to unpack. There is, I promise. I think it's also worth noting that for generations like Gen Z, we've basically documented our entire lives. We can go back and watch home videos, at least I can, of myself as a child from literally my birth to now. And because of that level of documentation and almost surveillance of our own lives that we've done with our own phones and photos and cameras, etc., we're able to literally go back, almost view what a life was like for us, for example, in 2010, 2013, 2016. On Snapchat, for example, or on your Photos app, or even on Facebook, you'll get these notifications. On this day 6 years ago, that's designed for you to go back and see the photos that you captured back then. And also designed kind of to keep you on the app because they know that nostalgia keeps you interested. Although, of course, older generations can also look back on photos of them as children and listen to music that they used to listen to back in the day. I don't think they have just as much content to tap into. In fact, according to an article that was written by The Atlantic, basically Ben Rowan wrote in 2017 that due to technology, nostalgia is now effectively on demand. In the past, nostalgia was rarer. It was a fleeting feeling that you randomly felt when you heard a song on the radio that you hadn't heard in years. When you heard the theme song of a TV show you used to watch that randomly came on late night TV that you hadn't heard in, say, 15 years, because you couldn't just Google it. You couldn't just Google these things. And in fact, according to research by GWI, Gen Z are apparently more nostalgic than other generations. Apparently up to 15% of Gen Z would prefer to think about the past than the future. Now, according to Stephanie Harlow, who's a senior trends analyst at GWI, she says that Gen Z is nostalgic for eras based on the vibe, which is kind of a hilarious thing to say because it's like, is that not what nostalgia is? Anyway, what do you mean by that? What do you mean? I think that we can pick up the pieces here. Like, it makes sense when you unpack it a little further. When you look at the context that Gen Z, who are the emerging group of adults, have been living through over the last few years, which is the same context that everyone else has been living through. However, the difference is that we are emerging as adults in a world that we were kind of told could be hopeful. We were really sold this idea as young adults that we could do anything we wanted to do. We could do anything because technology was so exciting, because the world was changing so rapidly. We could change the world and the world would change with us. The pandemic really was a time that stripped a lot of that hope away, because not only were we confined in spaces and we lost that human interaction, I do believe that a lot of people got caught up on echo chambers online, and we saw a very strong rise in the far right due to these echo chambers and due to the rise in misinformation and disinformation. And it really detached us from our surrounding community. It also detached us from these collective goals that I would say a lot of Gen Z, Gen Z really were the climate generation. We were so excited to make green, progressive change for our society and to uphold human rights. And while many of us still do, we're talking about a very small minority still here when it comes to the far right, there is a notable difference. There is a notable difference with young people and their views and their political opinions. And I mean, let's just face it, hate speech is not a political opinion. Let's just clear that. Let's clear that one up. This real divide that happened in among Gen Z was a bit of a shock for a lot of us. It threw a lot of us off, I would say, and it stripped back that level of hope that many of us had for the future, and it caused a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear, I think, among our generation. During the pandemic, obviously, wealth inequality was significantly intensified. Billionaires became richer, everyone else became poorer, and that wealth divide has caused shockwaves throughout the world, particularly because billionaires are now ruling countries. We're seeing the United States turn into an oligarchy before our eyes. But not only that, we're seeing the ways that billionaires are benefiting off of the mining industry. We're seeing the way that billionaires are benefiting off of fossil fuels, and we're really clocking that, hey, actually, I don't think that we're going to see that climate activism that so many of us expected from our governments and so many of us hoped for. And that's not to say that we're not going to see that ever in the future, but that reality is a really tough pill to swallow. Many of us, among Gen Z in particular, I think, are feeling overwhelmed and a lot of apathy for the world, a lot of meaninglessness, and a lot of fear that is sort of suppressed into this nihilism, this feeling that nothing matters. And of course, the pandemic was a horrific time for everyone involved, and countries needed to lock down in order to protect their societies, in order to protect their most vulnerable citizens from a very deadly virus. With this in mind, Stephanie Harlow refers to Gen Z as suffering from crisis fatigue, which she defines as the feeling of overwhelm and helplessness that we experience when exposed to constant pressures, which then leads us to craving a kind of lighthearted relief or going back and thinking back on a time that we perceived to be as simpler. Evidently, there's a very strong overlap here with nostalgia and escapism, and we particularly are seeing that obviously with culture and movies and music. In this context, this could all seem quite sad, and I don't know, when I read these statistics, I felt quite sad for Gen Z because I was like, damn, are we preferring to look back on the past than live in the present? That's really depressing, but it doesn't have to be depressing. I read some incredible research undertaken by psychologists that basically suggests that we could be using nostalgia right now as an almost regulation technique. So the idea is that times of meaninglessness and feelings of loneliness encourage us to look back on the past or look back on times that brought us joy. And when we then look back on those times that brought us joy in that moment, we then feel joy, we feel happy, which creates the motivation that we need to do good things, to try and foster that experience again. And there's research to show that nostalgia can be a really powerful tool in progressing us forward, which is something to hold close to you, especially if you're particularly interested in nostalgia and you're particularly feeling nostalgic at the moment. Don't worry, that could actually be like a very healthy mechanism that you're engaging in. It makes the situation feel a bit lighter, which we really need right now, honestly. Like, I do not want to be making content at the moment that feels heavy. I think there's enough of that going on at the moment. Of course, I'm going to keep talking about all of the important topics. Of course, I'm going to advocate for human rights as I always do. Of course, I'm going to keep the progressive message going. But sometimes we need some light relief. We do. We really do. And particularly right now. But there's something really interesting that happens when nostalgia is used in political contexts rather than cultural contexts. And this is so interesting to me because I always understood nostalgia as this kind of personal experience, as an experience where you would look back on a particular memory that you had and romanticize that personal memory. But in the research that I undertook, it basically demonstrated that you can experience collective nostalgia. So, according to Joris Lammers, collective nostalgia refers to a shared memory between a group of individuals, which can include yearning for a time period in which many only know about indirectly. The idea is there only needs to be a small number of people, an in-group, who actually have a personal memory or recollection of the time that's being romanticized. They then share how great that time was with a broader set of people who then almost secondhand obtain the nostalgia for that period because they're hearing about, wow, this period was fantastic and these stories sound amazing. In the context of politics, Lammers writes about this idea as being an almost mobilization tool for conservatism and the far right. And in the context of, for example, Make America Great Again, I don't think this is particularly shocking that nostalgia is used in political contexts as well. There's some very interesting points here here because there's a fine line between indirect collective nostalgia, which is often based on distorted memories of the past, because everyone's memory of the past, as I spoke about earlier, is influenced by rosy recollection, which creates a distortion. So then if you're only indirectly latching onto this version of events, you're then applying your own biases to this memory that you don't even have. And then suddenly you're visualizing utopia. Suddenly this distorted memory is a complete fallacy, is misinformation, and sometimes propaganda. Now, why would it be more aligned with conservative ideology? Well, according to Lammers, this is because conservatism is inherently based on a version of events in the past, or at least keeping events as they are, maintaining the status quo. The thing is, in many conservative circles, they believe that basically society has gone too far to the left. They believe that progressive policies has significantly hindered the world, that social welfare and human rights protection somehow is bad. Because they believe the world's gone too far to the left, they don't want to maintain the world as it is. They want to go back in time. In fact, this desire to return to a time, an ambiguous time often, is so strong that according to research undertaken by Lammers and Baldwin, if you frame a pro-leftist policy like pro-environmental rights and pro-environmental policy protection in the context of going back in time to a greener society rather than moving forward to a greener society, more conservatives actually vote for the policy, which is something that I honestly think we should all test on someone in our lives that we think has more conservative views than us, because this could potentially be a really important mobilization force. Honestly, when I read this, I laughed out loud because I was like, there's no way. Like, there's no way. We found a hack. Guys, there's a hack. Use it. Now, this doesn't actually work in every context and is quite specific, according to certain researchers, to a Western context, because other researchers have basically performed a similar study in Turkey, finding that in fact the opposite was true, that people who hold more left-leaning ideas are actually more nostalgic for the past and use nostalgia more in their political ideology than people in right-wing spaces. So that's really interesting. It depends so much on the context of your country, the history of your country, your nation. There's definitely needs to be some more research done in this space, but this type of nugget, this type of gold nugget is truly why I do these podcasts, because when I find something like this, it just, I don't know, the level of satisfaction that I feel is so ridiculous. The thing is about nostalgia is that because it's so powerful clearly among conservatives and people in these spaces, it can be used to deflect or basically obscure what a political party is actually trying to do. In research undertaken by Stefan Muller and Sven Oliver Proksch, they basically looked at pan-European culture and looked at different political manifestos across Europe. And they found that about 10% of these manifestos used nostalgia in one form or another. However, in particular, those 10% tended to be more conservative and right-leaning, and the use of nostalgia didn't necessarily add anything to what that political party was actually going to bring to the table in terms of tangible policy. Instead, they said, nostalgia can be used to confuse and distract when parties don't actually have concrete solutions or plans for the future, or even to disguise controversial policies that they may be seeking to implement if they won office. Returning back to the MAGA campaign, I think that this campaign is very heavily rooted in nostalgia, and I think this is the thing with a lot of nostalgia usage in political campaigns, is that there's no one particular era that Trump is trying to take America back to. It seems to be an ambiguous concoction of a bunch of different eras. So obviously there's post-Second World War America when it comes to family values and social policy and misogyny and racism, homophobia, etc. There's also 1980s neoliberal capitalism that Trump definitely does not want to let go of. In fact, if you look at the state of America right now and the level of inequality, wealth inequality that is going on, and the level of benefit that he is experiencing from the current 2025 economy, you'd have to really convince me that he actually wanted to go back in time when it comes to the state of the economy in the United States, because I don't think that he actually wants to tweak with that. I think what he mainly wants to do is, or at least the Republicans at large, this MAGA campaign at large, they're looking at essentially turning the US into a fascist state and using social policy at a minimum to maintain systems of white supremacy, patriarchy, and basically undermine the rights of literally every minority that has ever existed and stepped foot in the United States. But the way that they do that so that they don't lose votes is to say that they want to return to a simpler time and use nostalgia as this umbrella to paint a kind of romantic picture of what the United States used to look like in the 1950s. Without critical thinking, cross-checking, opening up a textbook of history, it could be quite easy to persuade someone that life really was better in the 1950s. And I'm actually not saying this tongue-in-cheek. I genuinely think that in the current state of the world, with the cost of living crisis, all of these threats that we're facing, the climate crisis, lack of adequate healthcare in places like the United States, not enough funding when it comes to education, rising cost of rent, lack of public housing, all of these things that are making your average lifestyle for your average citizen far worse than it was in the past. Looking back on an era where your kind of middle American was doing a lot better, that's not that radical to look back on that time and go, oh, well, it did seem to be better. The problem is that when you advocate for going back to a particular time without changing social policies, without considering that the other alternative could be to invest more in social welfare spending, to invest more in social policy that's intersectional to uplift the rights of minority groups. In our current world, to invest more in climate policy, to invest more in all of these things that would actually benefit us right now, these ideas that would support us through into the future sustainably, when that alternative, when this systemic change alternative isn't presented and isn't given considerable legitimate thought and airtime, the only alternative for many is to go back in time. That's the only alternative that's being presented to people. And of course, when you're only looking at one option, that option is going to look a whole lot better than your current situation. I think a bizarre example of this is the Tradwife trend and this whole idea of returning to soft living, which is another thing that I've seen a lot on social media, particularly among women. You know, return to your femininity. It's very tied with conservative gender essentialist norms and the idea that women should be this very specific feminine woman who serves her husband. It's very heteronormative and it's very entrenched in visions of femininity being tied to visions of whiteness. I've done an entire video essay on this, and so I'm not going to go too far in depth right now, but I do think that this return to the Tradwife era, return to post-war era for women is packaged as this way of solving the problem that is women having to do it all. Women are now entering the workplace and can now do incredible things in the workplace. There are far less barriers to us when it comes to our own financial and economic freedom. The problem is the statistics show that women are still doing more housework and caring duties than men. And when you combine those things, it's not sustainable and it's very hard for the average woman to be able to do everything. And so I do think that this problem is being packaged as, well, why don't you do less, but just do the caretaking housework stuff? We'll take care of the financial stuff. While we are at it, let's just strip away some other rights so you stay in your lane and don't try and work again because that didn't work well for you. Just totally misses the mark. It just totally misses the point. The point should really be to monetize, I think, care duties, to actually seriously consider ways in which we can ensure that women who do perform more caretaking duties are better compensated for it. And every time I talk about this, I get at least one comment saying that the gender pay gap doesn't exist. In fact, in Australia, women still earn only 78 cents to the dollar, and this is due to various things, including taking career breaks, including taking leave to take care of their children, including the fact that there are still far more men in leadership positions than there are women, including the embedded patriarchy that still exists within most workplace frameworks, fundamentally from like a foundational level. For these reasons, women are still earning less than men. There's still a gender pay gap to address. I'm preaching to the choir, I'm aware, but returning back to a time which has such strict gender roles, which takes us back eons when it comes to the level of effort and energy that women who lived through the 1950s put in so that we would not have to live through that. They fought for our rights. They fought for our ability to be here today in 2025. And while they may not be 100% satisfied with the state of the world right now, I think they'd be pretty impressed by the extent to which women are empowered at the moment comparative to the level that they used to be. Because of this, it's far more productive for society to invest more time, energy, effort, academia, research, thought, money into finding out solutions that we can embed into our current system to push us forward rather than returning backwards. And of course, to point out the obvious again, using nostalgia to talk about this period in such a romanticized light completely misses the fact that so many women were really unhappy. Most women in these roles, most women who had to be confined to the house were feeling extremely unempowered because a lot of them had had a taste of paid employment during the war. A lot of them were extremely isolated. A lot of them were told that their worth was to serve their husband, which isn't very, self-empowering. It's important to just remember that, and it's important to look at the facts. It's important to look at how many women were on prescribed medication just to get them through the day during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It's important to look at how many women were on unprescribed medications to get them through the day. We need to look at the past as a way to propel forward by learning from our failings from the past and by learning from what's good about the past. But nostalgia to present the past is not an objective, critically thought out portrayal of what actually happened. And when we use a distortion of the past to try and advocate for a particular interest, that is not using democracy in its truest form, which is to ensure that society and members of society, voters, are adequately informed about the policies that they are voting for. That is not like free, objective information. That's distortion, that's misinformation, disinformation, and as I said, sometimes even propaganda. So to sum up today's episode, I think that unless you're talking to someone who actually grew up, maybe was an adult in the 1950s, which would require you to speak to someone who's over the age of 90, then I don't think that we should really be thinking about going back to the 1950s. I really just don't think that it's worthwhile doing. I really just think we should invest our time and energy right here, right now, try and make the most of what we've got, try and propel us forward, try and invest in social policy, in left-leaning policy, in changing systems that actually support everyone, and then you can get a seat at the table. To sum it all up today, I think nostalgia is a really fascinating one. It's definitely being felt more among Gen Z at the moment and among young people, and I think across the board as well. And there are clearly loads of reasons for this. It's not necessarily bad. In fact, it could be good for us to be thinking about the past to propel us forward. But as soon as we're getting caught in the past and caught in this version of reality in the past, maybe it's time to question whether or not life really was like that, or whether or not we're looking at it with too much rose tint on our glasses. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in this week. I love you all lots. I really hope you're doing okay. Please do something good for yourself. Please do something nice. I hope you've spent some time outside in the sun. Leave me a comment. Let me know what your favorite period is to romanticize, what era you're nostalgic for, and if you can relate to romanticizing 2016 or if you think that's a whole load of malarkey. I don't think I've ever said that. Anyway, bye. Love you so much.